it. We're broke. Thanks for the reminder. On and on these exchanges would go. We were on everyone's bankruptcy watch list. Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, all of them were predicting our demise. And they were speculating which city would be next, Stockton, Detroit, and we were always at least one of the top 2 or 3 cities that were rumored to go bankrupt. So what happened? Well, I'm pleased to report to you tonight that the City of Fresno's budget is now structurally balanced. On July 10th of 2014, we paid off all of our remaining negative fund balances a full 8 years ahead of schedule. Budgets, record unemployment, 3 credit downgrades, festering poverty and homelessness are Swearengin's enduring legacy. Huh? Turning the city's finances around, now we're the 5th best job-creating city in the state, and my legacy is soaring deficits and record unemployment? For a minute, I thought Betty was referring to her former boss, Gray Davis. You see, Betty Yee was the chief deputy in the Department of Finance to Governor Gray Davis, and she continually touts how she took the lead in budget planning and negotiations. Well, when Betty Yee took the job, the state had a balanced budget, and in their first 2 years, her team expanded government spending by 35% from one-time revenues. The structural deficit this created ended up putting the state over $30 billion in the hole by the time she left. Her department recommended raiding the state's pension fund money and using it for even more additional spending. But to make up the difference, they devised a plan to take out loans to backfill the pension fund monies. Things got so bad that the Davis administration, that the state tried to unload its fiscal mistakes onto the backs of local government. In fact, even Jerry Brown, as mayor of Oakland, personally went to Sacramento to warn that this move would take his city to the brink. Indeed, this state suffered through 15 years of structural deficits because of the Davis-Yee budgets. My opponent's main argument to the voters is, elect me. I've been doing this a long time. It's true that Betty Yee has been a Sacramento budget insider for a very, very long time, but what difference does time in the saddle make if you're riding the wrong horse? 3 years of Davis-Yee budgets resulted in over $30 billion in debt, and 10 years on the State Board of Equalization when, by the way, the state's business tax climate dropped from 38th in the nation to 48th in the nation during Betty's time on the board, according to the Tax Foundation. In contrast, in just under 6 years, we've righted the city's financial ship, and we've addressed the planning and the infrastructure needed to support private sector job growth. All of that done, by the way, during the worst financial climate since the Great Depression. It's not about time in the saddle. It's about results. And indeed, there is a stark contrast in this year's contest for the State Comptroller's Office. When I was growing up, my mom was a public school teacher. She taught American history to juniors and seniors at Southside High School in Fort Smith, Arkansas. As a kid, I would always know when my summer vacation was coming to an end because my mom would pack me up in the car and schlep me down to the school, and we'd have to help her set up the classroom for the new school year. Now imagine being on the 2nd floor of a 2-story building in Fort Smith, Arkansas in the middle of August with no air conditioning. It was miserable. There we were in the worst humidity you can imagine, stapling past presidents' pictures up on the bulletin board, sweat dripping down every part of our bodies. And yet, while we were working, my mom was standing there working, telling me how much she loved American history. She would always say to me, Ashley, you gotta learn your history now. Learn history now, because when you're older, you'll regret it if you don't learn it. And then inevitably, she would always quote Edmund Burke and say, those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. Well, those words are hundreds of years old now, and yet they're so profound and so magnified in my mind today as I consider the financial crisis that we've just endured. All you have to do is just look over your shoulder at the last several decades of financial history in California to know that major changes are needed. The annual state payments to CalPERS in 1999 was $130 million. Today, that number is $4.6 billion a year. Today, the estimates of the state's total outstanding obligations is over $500 billion, and that does not include the long list of infrastructure deficits we experience around the state. $500 billion. That's over $12,000 of indebtedness and outstanding obligations per Californian per year. So how did we get here? We need to ask ourselves that question, as my mom would say, know your history. And how do we get out of here? And how do we make sure that we never repeat this history? Well, the Office of State Controller can play a critical role in answering both of these questions. As State Controller, my top initiatives will include, number one, advocating for a 90-10 budget plan, where 90% of our general fund revenues go to pay for ongoing operations, today's expenses, while 10% of our general fund revenues go towards securing our financial future, reducing debt, addressing unfunded liabilities, and at some point, funding infrastructure that improves quality of life and supports economic growth. Number two, conducting an annual economic competitiveness audit. In addition to financial audits of state government operations, I'm calling for an annual economic competitiveness audit. We know that the greatest determination of our state's long-term budget stability is the success or the failure of our state's economy. This annual audit will lead to the development of a comprehensive economic development plan for our state. And lastly, according to a state auditor's report on the State Controller's Office, the state's top fiscal watchdog needs some watching. The state auditor found arithmetic errors, gaps in employee training, communication, management challenges, all in the State Controller's Office today. I believe the State Controller's Office needs to be subjected to the same level of scrutiny or higher that I would impose on any other division of state government as State Controller. So I propose an outside management audit of this office and that an independent audit committee be established on a go-forward basis to monitor and to scrutinize the work of the State Controller's Office. Only with that level of scrutiny and transparency will we gain the credibility needed to be an effective advocate for long-term fiscal and economic health in California. I began this evening by talking about the two women in my life who have been the most influential, my mom and my grandmother. My grandparents were a part of the World War II generation. They were among the millions who would become known as the greatest generation. I'm certainly no historian, but I can offer you my own observations and my own personal experiences with what made this generation so great. And what stands out to me more than anything else about my grandparents and their generation is that they were willing to make personal sacrifices for the next generation. My grandmother, who never went to college, worked 2 jobs to make sure that her 3 children would all complete college. Her children were always clothed with the best they could possibly afford to provide, but she only herself had 2 or 3 dresses, and she would just rotate through them in any given work week. She would make all kinds of other countless sacrifices for her children, and too many examples for me to provide here tonight. But in short, it was all about the next generation. So when I consider these sacrifices and what was done for me and my generation, my instant reaction is, well, we got to turn around and do the same thing for the next generation, for our kids and our grandkids. It was done for us. Today, though, it's not that great of a picture when I consider what our children would inherit in the state of California. $500 million in outstanding liabilities. No real plan for long-term investments in capacity-adding infrastructure. And instead of doing the heavy lifting required to develop the long-term financial and economic plans to put our state on a positive trajectory, it seems all Sacramento insiders can do is argue over the spoils of a previous generation. $500 billion of indebtedness and outstanding liabilities. This has to stop. I believe that's the leadership call of this generation. Inspired by the sacrifices made by our parents and our grandparents, it's now our mantle of leadership, and it is our opportunity to live out today with tomorrow in mind. But that's going to take standing up to the status quo thinking in Sacramento and the single interest groups who today have a chokehold on the stewardship of our state's fiscal health. This is a challenging assignment, to say the least, and victory is not guaranteed. The Sacramento status quo interests are powerful, and they are moneyed. We're going to need to gather as big a coalition as possible for any chance of victory. And in my view, we ought to embrace any and all who are willing to accept this challenge of restoring the long-term financial health of the state. In fact, I believe that the new dividing line of California politics is not so much about partisanship as it is between those who are willing to stand up to the status quo and those who are not. Case in point, Democrat Mayor of San Jose, Chuck Reed, my friend, and as a Republican, someone whose support I'm pleased to have earned. He's leading his city and our state on pension reform.